Hi, I'm Wayne Brittenden for the Political Compass podcasts. Increasingly, throughout the Western democracies especially, many academics are concerned about the corporate culture that's changing the traditional values and structures of universities, especially in the fields of science and even more so, the humanities. Peter Wills is one of those academics. He's a professor from the Faculty of Science at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, and he's our guest in this Political Compass podcast. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Is the corporatization of higher education really a reality, or has it been exaggerated in all of the books and articles that we've been seeing about it?
Oh, I think that it's a reality. There's such a sharp contrast over a reasonably long period of time, let's say over 20 years, from about the mid 80s until where we are in the mid teens. And the big difference is that we've shifted from what was a quasi-democratic style of governance in universities, which is becoming of an academy, to an absolutely corporate hierarchical model in which academic members of staff are employees of the corporation and are subject to line management. And so that is the main difference in terms of the structure of the way in which universities operate. But then if you look at the real substance and the reality of how they operate, it's even more dramatic than that. Because with a mostly democratic structure, as we used to have, departmental and school meetings and decisions would be made usually by trying to achieve some kind of consensus, which really wasn't coerced. You had shared or rotating headships of departments and schools, whereas now we're in the corporate model. These people who are going to be heads are often appointed from outside, and they are brought in to do specific jobs. And when they come in from the outside, they don't have any institutional knowledge of how the school or the department is operated. And so they're free to just put their stamp on it, which is what they're expected to do, and to sort of be it's always the knight in shining armor who comes and fixes everything up. Whether or not there was anything that needed fixing, there is usually something which needs fixing in terms of the university administration. But whether or not they really make it better can't be judged except in relation to the history of the place. And that history is set aside at the very beginning. And so it's always judged that they've done wonderful things when they've put their stamp on it. And all of this is measured in terms of metrics of performance, but that's something that can be gamed. And that's what staff within the institutions game in order for them to get some sort of personal gain. So people end up now in this modern university concentrating on the criteria, the form of what it is that is supposed to be done, because that's what they get rewarded for. And the substance doesn't get properly judged. There aren't criteria really for judging substance, because substance is something which really has to take into proper account a history over a long period of time and so on. And so the things that are really rewarded are things that occur through self-promotion. So assessments are always talked in terms of a lot of gung-ho things that is supposed to happen. It is, like any corporation, a very masculine sort of world, I would say. And that means that mostly things are judged in terms of power, success, which translates into money. And if somebody is not prepared to compete in that sort of world, then they are no longer a really valued member of a university, because they're not part of the corporate hierarchical structure.
What you're describing is a situation where we have universities top heavy with administrators, more full-time administrators probably than ever before, and their agenda is quite different to the academics.
Absolutely. Even faculties, when they meet, no longer have democratic style meetings. They're meetings, and this occurs in senates or whatever they're called in different universities, where the vice chancellor, the rector, or the head of the university comes in and is supposedly chairing a meeting, but basically sits down and gives a report on what is happening and what is going to happen. And the decisions are by and large already made. And so when the Senate or the faculty decides that they're going to try and get something different from what has been decided, it more or less turns into a fight, and it's quite difficult because people generally don't want to start off on the basis of saying, no, we're not going to do it. We are going to go into revolt over this. And that is what they more or less have to do in order to change anything in any substantial way. And it didn't used to be like that. The way that it used to be 40 years ago, as I remember it, is everybody would get together and, it would be polite, but on the other hand, there would be substantial disagreements. And at the end of it, you would normally have a vote. And at the end of the discussion, as in the parliament or whatever, the majority would carry the day, and then people would accept that as having been a decision that they can live with, and then they would get on with life. Whereas now, all you can do is go away from a meeting and complain about what you're going to have to do. And by hook or by crook, you have to do it the way that it's being laid down. And so that's a very big difference in terms of the relationship between the average staff member and the kind of edicts or the kind of instructions that they're given from the upper echelons of the hierarchy.
So how did the administration come to be so much at odds with the running of the faculties?
Well, I think that mostly this is something which has occurred in all sorts of governance aspects of society over the course of these last 40 years or whatever, probably starting at the beginning of the 80s, but very much so by the time you get to the beginning of the 90s. And basically, well, within universities, the democratic structures were set aside. That's what's happened by and large, and there have been quite, let's say, typical examples of how that's been done in different places. I mean, in my own university here, it happened as a result in the end of legislation which was passed, which put the universities under much more governmental control, free market governmental control than they'd been under before. So instead of being sort of part of the governmental structure, the members of universities, staff members of universities, were abandoned to chief executives who then had some sort of responsibility through a board, but really ran free market type institutions. And I notice when I go to Germany, my colleagues there will say to me, well, at least we are still employed by the state, as is the rector of the university. And when push comes to shove, I can actually appeal to the state in terms of my employment status. Whereas in a university here in New Zealand, for example, you are just beholden to normal employment law. And so any appeal to academic freedom or anything like that has to be through the provisions which are made for that, which are rather weak, even if they are written down.
Well, we have more students globally, I think, than ever before, and yet proportionately fewer professors, particularly in the humanities. How's that come about?
Well, that's just driven economically. It's driven financially within the institutions. Because with the beginning of the corporate university, what happened was that there was a new style of accounting where everything was divided up into little units, and each of those administrative units had to be able to pay for itself in terms of every aspect of its life. That is, a department had to pay rent to the university for the number of offices that it had. That's one example. Of course, they were given the money to do it, but that means it was a different sort of accounting rather than the building assets of the university being under some central financial booking arrangement. They were split up into each of the individual departments and had to be justified in some way. And that happens with every aspect of university life now. A head of department basically has to look out for every budget line and to keep it within reason, and it's a much less benign situation than it used to be, and one which requires much more attention to be paid to every last dollar than used to be that way. There used to be more compensation between the parts of the university, let's say STEM subjects, which can get research funds or other sources of income, perhaps from industry, and let's say the humanities. The humanities in the end would have been, if you want to look at it that way, offset financially by money which the STEM subjects could bring into the university. And I think that that's largely how it happened, by the fragmentation of the accounting system down to these little units which had to be self-sustaining.
Well, as you come to be more dependent on outside funding and not government funding, obviously the humanities are going to suffer because corporate interests don't see much worth in a lot of the humanities subjects compared with science or computer technology, or of course the all-important business studies.
Yeah, well, it isn't just a matter of their seeing worth. There isn't as much money available within our community for those sorts of things, and you can see that in the neoliberal economies that we have, where the arts don't have the same value as business or technology, and so there's less sponsorship or less availability for people to live lives and have a sustainable sort of income, which is based on artistic endeavor rather than direct economic production endeavor.
Traditionally, we've seen the autonomous, tenured professor playing the role of both scholar and teacher, and that seems to be disappearing.
Well, certainly within the STEM subjects, that's the case, because if you can get a big research grant, then you employ postdocs, you have PhD students, yes, but you can buy out most of your time from teaching. And so there are many professors who no longer appear before students very much. They don't have many teaching responsibilities. They are just basically there running their research empires, they become, some of them, which is self-funding in the sense that they can always get new research grants on the basis of their past performance, which is judged by and large, I would say, in terms of their continued publication in big journals. And so you have much bigger empires as far as individual staff members are concerned than you ever used to have under the old system. So even the research and the way that it's conducted and the funds are split up for it, it's all administered and it all occurs in a much more hierarchical fashion and a much higher hierarchy than there ever was before.
So if a science faculty is more dependent on outside funding, that means the science faculty will be more engaged in commercial projects than those undertakings that might benefit the wider population.
Yeah, I think that that's true by and large too, and that's where you get into the difficulties. Let's say in the biological sciences, for example, where you can get very big funding from big pharma, big industries like the pharmaceutical industry or agriculture. And then there is a kind of a compromise of some sort between the autonomy of the institution and the freedom of the researcher and the need to deliver on the payment which is being given out by the sponsor, by the person who is supplying the money to run the research. And that puts some activities into a completely different category than they were before. I remember going the first time that I went to a presentation of a research group in which the person who was doing a master's said they couldn't give any detail of what they were actually doing and what their results were because this was a commercial secret. Now, this is a person who's at the first stage of becoming a research scientist, and they can't share their results in a critical environment within the institution from which they're going to be rewarded a degree for learning. They can't be subject to the critical feedback from other staff members because other staff members aren't allowed to know the commercial secrets on which they're basically working on.
That certainly is a conflict of interest. Is it that new, though? We know that the tobacco industry had universities working on projects about the health dangers of tobacco, and that was covered up for decades.
Yeah, well, I guess we won't know for decades what the extent of that sort of thing happening now is. Those things are often difficult to get to the bottom of. And I guess that all you could really do if you wanted to look into that would be to go and find out how much money is being given and what are the conditions of secrecy which are involved in terms of the research. But if you look into the literature and the fights that happen in the literature now on this very topic, there are numerous examples of cases in which there have been conflicts of interest which have borne themselves out in various ways. The latest example that we would have would be in relation to COVID. Now, this wasn't to do with academic institutions, but it goes to the heart of the scientific endeavor and its objectivity, and that is the fact that Peter Daszak of the Eco Alliance in New York got money from the National Institutes of Health, and then some of that was funneled into the Wuhan Institute, which some people suspect may have been the source of a biological accident or something that gave rise to COVID. And yet Peter Daszak, having solicited a letter which was published in the Lancet saying that COVID absolutely was a natural phenomenon and not involved in anything that came out of a laboratory, went with the WHO, one of the leading members of the WHO investigation, went to Wuhan and didn't even ask the questions which needed to be asked of the people at the Wuhan Institute in terms of their safety standards and in terms of the kind of experimentation that was being done. Now, his name is published his name is on published papers coming out of Wuhan several years before that. He had a close collaboration with them, and yet he was the WHO, one of the WHO people who went to investigate whether anything had gone wrong in the institution where he had actually been involved in working himself and helping fund the activity from American sources. Those are the kinds of things that you never get to the bottom of in the event when they're actually happening. But there are many, many such things which happen within the scientific community, and I'm sure within other communities quite often. And our universities now are set up more and more for that sort of thing to happen.
Peter, you talk about going back 40 years and remembering those days. Younger academics coming onto the scene know no other model other than the corporate model. So as your generation retires, who's going to be holding the torch for the uncorporatized university where the traditional role is of the critic and conscience of society? That seems to be going very fast.
Yeah, I think that it is disappearing. I'm sure that there are people who, in one way or another, plenty of young people who sort of see through what is happening. But my experience is that this is something about which they are cynical rather than something about which they feel that they can achieve any real change. I think that they accept that universities are corporate institutions. They belong to that part of society, and when you work for them, you've got to behave as a member. You've got to follow the rules and do it well. You're not going to be employed there for very long if you don't. And they just accept that as part of the coercion of reality that they have to face in every aspect of life, here and there, in everything that they do. I think that our societies as a whole are much more coercive and concentrated in terms of the demands, and those demands are ones which require a great deal more conformity than we had in what I would call the looser past, which is what I think that I experienced when I began my university career 40 years ago.
And of course, when you began your career and for quite a long time afterwards, the number of students a university could take on board was largely related to the size of the lecture theatres. Now, with COVID, the perfect opportunity to have unlimited numbers of students because of the online lectures.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that we're yet to see how that plays itself out. Um, Perhaps, and I guess this is something that I would hope for, the negative experience to some extent, which both students and staff have from the online interaction and the lack of face-to-face interaction and learning, may produce a situation in which there is a demand for a return to something which is a little bit more directly human in terms of the way in which people interact with one another in the learning process. I mean, at the moment, things are heading down the direction that you indicate of more online courses and more automated kind of assessment and so on, impersonal, a large number of papers being graded by individual staff members, each of whom, or maybe none of whom, the students actually have any personal contact with.
There does seem to be a real obsession with rank and ratings these days.
Absolutely. Yes, and that's what the universities judge themselves on to a considerable extent. The ratings that they get give them their status as institutions, and their status as institutions in those terms, at least so they believe, is what puts them in a position to get their income, that is to attract overseas students, some of whom are now completely online. It can always be said because of COVID, but even if we move into something which is really post-COVID, we wonder whether or not the universities are going to continue to enroll people under those circumstances. And then that requires staff members to run two courses in parallel if they've got a face-to-face course, and then there are some members of that course, some students in that course who are doing it remotely, probably overseas. Then you have to have a different kind of approach and a different kind of means of providing for the students who you don't see face to face, who you can't just tell in the classroom what's going to happen the next day or whatever. Everything has to be much more controlled and regimented for the online students.
We're seeing also universities bringing corporate values into their own presentation to the public. We're seeing more and more universities advertising their own brand as being better than another one. Isn't that very inappropriate for an institution of higher learning?
I personally have always found that obnoxious, that you get up and say that we are the best, come to us, this is going to be a better experience than you're going to get anywhere else. But universities are indeed like that. They're competing for what they call customers. There are very many meetings that take place now in which students are talked about as our customers. Now, you don't usually find academic staff members talking like that, but when people come around from HR or other parts of the administration, that is their focus, the student as the customer, who, well, they must be satisfied to some extent, but also that is the way in which they are talked about and the way in which they are going to be catered for. The degree to which they are given an experience which is satisfactory for them. Of course, they're going to have to pass the academic standard, but then you must judge the academic standard or assess the academic standard in a way which is sort of pleasant or amenable to them. Now, in human terms, of course, one never objects to that, but when that becomes the driving force, determining whether or not the student is actually going to tell other students or other potential students about the course and how it went, if that's the thing that you're most worried about, then that is going to distract you, and it does distract people from providing what is the best academic standard in terms of presentation and assessment of student performance.
So, Peter, we see the humanities subjects more and more marginalized in the university striving to please the students with their career aims. Is there a danger of the university becoming more and more simply a glorified technical college?
There is that sort of danger, particularly in STEM subjects, and the pressure is on for them to deliver what can easily be done within a time frame which is specified in advance. And so if you think of something like doing a PhD, then it's not going to drag out for 5 years. You're just going to get it done, and you're going to go out with the qualification, and you're going to have a set of papers demonstrating that you've done a course of that sort, but you aren't necessarily going to have really demonstrated very critical thinking across a broader range than the specialization that you've been doing your work in.
So being published is more important than being original?
Oh, yes, I would say that that's definitely the case now, because that's where all the rewards come from. The financial rewards to the university come to them according to a measure of outputs, not in terms of the quality of the experience that the students have. That's in the hands of the branding people to ensure that they present an image of themselves which is appealing to people who are going to potentially enroll in their courses and be supporting them financially in that way.
It does sound like a narrowing of the whole university experience. Is this the beginning, or is it already well underway, of the universe being removed from the university?
Yeah, well, I would say that that's well underway. And the kind of experience that students get, which is broader, I don't think that they really get until they leave and they go into a firm or something. And then they start to learn what is going on and become more critical and more able to evaluate the way that people are behaving within a power structure, because nobody's encouraged at the university to think about what is happening within that power structure. But when they go out into the real world and they're a part of it, they have to cope with it. They have to cope with somebody being their boss and demands that are made on them, some of which they may feel are quite unreasonable. The only thing they feel unreasonable while they're at university is when they're undergraduates, they may feel that they've been marked unreasonably and unfairly and want some sort of revision of that. But it isn't something which is deeper and in principle, which is what people tend to feel, I think, when they encounter situations outside which have deeper ethical implications.
Peter, looking ahead in another 40 years' time, what's the university, the public university, going to look like?
So looking forward 40 years, I think that any institutions, even if they are run by governments, are going to be much more like private corporations, even more so than they are today. And I think that it has a lot to do with the gathering of information. I noticed how much information is gathered about every aspect of what happens in our, not just in our lives, but within the university. Every datum is kept somewhere and is gone over and is analysed. Everybody seems to think that artificial intelligence is going to allow us to extract great advantage from that. Artificial intelligence, I believe, will be applied, but whether or not it is an advantage to humanity as a whole is going to be highly questionable. And in universities, it is just going to increase the power of the institution and the hierarchy in order to achieve its institutional goals, rather than there being the kind of academic freedom which we would hope we might be able to get some return to, which is to a large extent constructed between individuals, yes, not just by individuals, but according to what they want to express about themselves and their relationship to the world. And that's the thing which goes down the drain in the corporation. When it's demanded of you that you behave in a certain way and you continually have increasing numbers of institutional norms that you have to meet and adhere to, then that detracts from the kind of freedom of individual expression and construction of ideas in terms of personal reality and the way in which a person feels about the world, as well as what they know about the world. And that is part of being an academic, which isn't often spoken about, but which I think is really important. The extent to which there is the personal involvement of the individual in what it is that they are teaching, what it is that they are researching, and the manner in which they express it to the outside world. That's what the individual in the academy used to be like, or that was the feeling that one had, that there was a very personal involvement and aspect to the work which was done as a member of the university. And I think we have lost a lot of that, and I imagine that unless we change things somehow, even more of that could be lost to processes which are outside of human control, except through computers, and exclude to an even greater extent that individual self-expression, which I think is an important part of being able to be a member of an academy.
Sometimes you must feel like one of the last professors.
Oh, I think that there are quite a few of us last professors, if you like, and I think there will be more people. You cannot crush the human spirit in the end, and that's what I think our last hope is.
Thank you, Peter, for being on the Political Compass podcasts, and all good wishes.
Thank you very much, Wayne.